Welcome to The Explainer. So, in early 2026, Iran was absolutely engulfed by the biggest wave of protests it had seen in years. We're going to break down the incredibly complex forces behind this crisis. Really, how a perfect storm of economic collapse, environmental disaster, and pure state repression brought millions of people out onto the streets. This one sentence from Professor Mahmoud Farzanegin, who's an expert on this stuff, just perfectly captures the raw desperation that lit the fuse. This wasn't just about politics anymore. For so many, it was about pure survival. This quote really sets the stage for the nationwide uprising we're about to dig into. So, when these protests kicked off in late December 2025, they were huge. I mean, they spread to all 31 of Iran's provinces. This wasn't just some localized flare-up. It was a national cry for help. So you gotta ask, why now? What made this the moment it all boiled over? Well, to really get it, we have to look at the immediate trigger, a catastrophic economic collapse that was the spark in the powder keg. Okay, so that initial spark, it was the total freefall of the Iranian economy. And we're not just talking about a downturn here. We're talking about a collapse that completely hollowed out people's savings, their businesses, and just the daily lives of millions of ordinary Iranians. Just look at this number, 1.46 million. That is how many Iranian rials it took to buy a single US dollar in January 2026, a record low. Can you imagine trying to run a business? For merchants in places like Tehran's Grand Bazaar, this made pricing anything rationally, well, completely impossible. The value of your money was just evaporating by the hour. And if you look at the government's own data, the picture gets even clearer. They admitted to an official inflation rate soaring over 52%. But honestly, that doesn't even tell the whole story. The price of food alone, that shot up by over 70%. This was a crisis that was eroding people's ability to just buy groceries, hour by hour. And the government's response to all this? They offered a new monthly allowance. For a whole family of four, it was worth just 26 US dollars. 26 bucks. As you can probably guess, this wasn't seen as a help. It was seen as a complete insult. It just showed how massively disconnected the regime was from what people were actually going through. The economic collapse was absolutely the trigger, no doubt. But it's not the whole story, not by a long shot. The gunpowder, so to speak, had been piling up for years, for decades really. These deep, systemic failures had turned the country into a tinderbox, just waiting for a spark. So let's peel back another layer here, because beyond that immediate economic pain, what you find is a state that's struggling with these fundamental, deep-rooted problems in energy, in the environment, and in its own governance. When you talk to analysts, they all point to these four interconnected failures as the long-term drivers of all this instability. You've got crippling energy shortages, decades of water scarcity, just widespread governance failures that are fueled by corruption, and of course, deep international isolation. You put all that together, that's how you get a perfect storm. The environmental crisis in Iran isn't some abstract problem for the future. It is a full-blown disaster happening right now. And it starts on the ground, with the shocking fact that 80% of the country's wetlands have dried up. This is because of decades of both drought and just terrible mismanagement. And here's where we see the direct link to daily life. Those dried up lake beds, they don't just disappear. They turn into sources for these massive dust storms. That dust just blankets cities like Tehran, forcing schools and offices to close and making the air literally toxic to breathe. Then you've got the energy crisis, what experts call an energy imbalance. So what does that mean? Well, simply put, the demand for power is constantly way higher than what the country's outdated infrastructure can produce. This imbalance costs Iranian industries an estimated $8 billion every year. It forces widespread blackouts and shutdowns that have, at times, halted up to half of the country's entire industrial capacity. So you're faced with this multifaceted crisis: economic, environmental, energy, and a furious population is pouring into the streets. How did the regime respond? Well, its response has been swift, it's been organized, and it has been absolutely brutal. Pay very close attention to the shift in language here. At first, state media called the protesters rioters. But as the protests got bigger, the label escalated to terrorists. Now, this isn't just a word change. It is a calculated legal and ideological move that basically gives them the justification to use lethal force. And that crackdown has been incredibly severe. Security forces, including the powerful IRGC and even the regular army, have just unleashed a deadly response. We're talking about the unlawful use of firearms, like shotguns loaded with metal pellets, mass arrests of over 2,000 people, nationwide internet blackouts to stop people from organizing, and even horrifying reports of attacks on hospitals that were treating the injured. And yet, even inside this brutal machine, we're starting to see cracks. This quote is from an anonymous officer. He told Time magazine he was in it for the money, not to kill people. This and other reports of security forces refusing to fire on protesters suggest that there could be some real fractures developing within the regime's repressive apparatus. Okay, so this is the crucial point. With the economy shattered, the environment collapsing, the people in the streets, and the state responding with an iron fist, where does Iran possibly go from here? The country has really reached a crossroads. According to an analysis from the Hudson Institute, there are basically 3 ways this could play out. 1. Total regime collapse, if those security forces really start to fracture. 2. A partial transformation, where maybe a military figure takes over and changes some policies just to survive. Or 3. The muddling through scenario, where they crush the protests, but the regime is left weaker and more paralyzed than ever. But here's the key. None of these scenarios see the Islamic Republic surviving 2026 with its power intact. The convergence of all these crises, economic, environmental, political, social, it's pushed the nation to a breaking point. The system is under more pressure now than at any other time since it was founded. It's leaving its future and the future of its 90 million people more uncertain than ever before. So, can it survive? That really is the